So hopefully you guys are seeing this after having watched the tree diagrams video that was before it. But we're going to go ahead and look at some of the things that may impact how a tree unfolds, especially when we start thinking about using physical morphological characteristics versus using genetics or the molecular clock that we will be discussing here in the future. So let's relate this to evolution a little bit more, and then we'll go ahead and talk even more about this when we get into classification in particular. So let's start with our essential questions. So first of all, what causes convergent evolution? We'll tell you what that means here in a minute, but you can probably figure it out just from the parts of the word. And then we'll start looking at what causes coevolution. So make sure you can distinguish between the two, convergent evolution versus coevolution. And number three, what are the similarities and differences between gradualism and punctuated equilibrium? Now, before we go ahead and jump into these, I want to review some important terms that we've already covered. The first of these is adaptive radiation. Now, if you remember your modes of natural selection, disruptive or diversifying selection can lead to adaptive radiation, where one species evolves into several. And we had that Edpuzzle video where we showed you the different species of salamander from the Formpicta that was in Northern California and has moved down two different routes into Southern California, one through the Coast Range and one along the Sierra Nevada. Okay, as they go ahead and start isolating themselves, remember, isolation is a big part of the modes of natural selection. They separate their gene pools and they start to develop different characteristics, which lead us to speciation, or the formation of new species. And so if you take a look at this little Y here, looking at these two different beetles, that branch point is called just that. It's a branch point where you start seeing a separation of the two groups of individuals that are becoming the different species. And so when we look at tree diagrams, hopefully you recognize that that represents a common or shared ancestor for those two individual species. Now, most of the time you'd probably think that they'd be easily identifiable as separate species because of accumulated traits. There are certain circumstances, however, where this isn't the case. And a great example of this is what we call convergent evolution. And this is a process by which unrelated organisms independently evolve similar characteristics or traits because they're adapting to similar environments. Now, if we talked about niches or the roles an organism plays in their ecosystem, different organisms will fill the same niche in different ecosystems. But as they fill the same niche, there are certain forms or structures that make an organism more effective at carrying out that particular task in an ecosystem. Because of this, different organisms may have similar characteristics or traits, even though they are unrelated, because the job they perform in their ecosystem is the same. If you take a look at these here, the giant armadillo, giant pangolin, spiny anteater, and giant anteater, these look very similar, especially when we start looking at their snout and their front claws. The reason for this is they're primarily insectivores, so they mostly eat insects. And when they go ahead and do this, it's beneficial to have a long snout and long tongue to go ahead and get the insects out of small spaces, and some sort of digging appendage to be able to go ahead and free those insects from whatever hiding place they may be found. Whether it's the giant anteater trying to go after a large termite mound, or something else for the pangolin, armadillo, or echidna. All right. So convergent evolution can produce the same traits even though they don't have the same ancestry. So we have to be careful when we construct our tree diagrams to show the actual relationships rather than just the morphological or phenotypic traits. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about coevolution. Now, hopefully you remember co means together. So evolving together. This is the process whereby which two species evolve in response to each other's changes. Now, any species that carry a symbiosis, a very close relationship, probably exhibit some amount of coevolution. So probably one of the most famous is pollination and the carrying of seeds. When plants have a particular pollinator, that pollinator is going to be adapted to pick up pollen from that particular plant. And so there's a process whereby certain plants and animals kind of make the evolutionary decision. They don't think about it, but this happens where they become very good at helping a particular plant. We think about like the Anna's hummingbird and the magnolia, um, manzanita, excuse me. And so when we start looking at this, you can see down at the bottom, this is a prime example of this. Now, Charles Darwin discovered the orchid that you see down there at the bottom. This is actually in some places called the Darwin orchid, and it had an enormously long pollen tube. And so most people said, no, there's no way that there's a moth that has a proboscis long enough to go ahead and pollinate that flower. But Darwin said if the plant exists and is widely found, then there must be a pollinator for it. And he predicted that there would be a sphinx moth, which is typically pollinating these types of orchids. And he predicted the existence of the sphinx moth before it was discovered. Now, unfortunately, he died before it was discovered, and it would take some night cameras to go ahead and identify it. And they actually have this enormous proboscis, which they kind of roll up and roll down like a fire hose. Okay. But these kind of night capture videos were able to go ahead and identify this ginormous sphinx moth, which pollinates the Darwin orchid. So these types of symbiotic relationships co-evolve often. You see the same sort of coevolution when you start looking at predator-prey relationships. You know, it's kind of an arms race where the predator becomes more effective at getting the prey, so the prey must, in order to survive, evolve some means of escaping or getting away from the predator, and they're constantly battling to keep up with each other. The last thing I wanted to kind of introduce you to today is a scientific disagreement. Now, the majority of scientists do not disagree on whether or not evolution occurred. This is pretty widely accepted. But some do disagree with certain small little aspects of how it occurred. And when we start looking at this, one of the sticking points is just about how fast these processes occur. Is the process of evolution really slow and gradual, or does it not happen for a while and then take place in these little bursts? Okay. Now, they have names for each of these, of course, and the bursts is known as punctuated equilibrium. Okay. So the two general theories regarding the process of change are what are known as gradualism, which accepts a very slow, kind of steady rate of change over time, as can be visualized in the tree on the bottom left. The other is in punctuated equilibrium, where there are long periods of little to no change, followed by short, rapid bursts of evolution. So take a minute, think about which one you believe is correct. Now, before you make your final decision, you may think you already have one in mind, but I want to throw this out at you. Now, punctuated equilibrium accepts the conventional idea that new species form over hundreds or thousands of generations and through extensive series of intermediate stages. But in geologic time, which is, remember, huge, we talked about deep time, it's so long that even a few thousand years appears to be just a blip or moment compared to what most species experience in terms of a lifespan. I mean, what is the average lifespan of a human, right? We're looking at lifespans of maybe 80, 100 years if you're lucky, right? Now, that's 10 generations potentially when you're starting to look, or more, at us even producing 1,000 years, which is nothing in terms of a $4.6 billion year timeline. Okay. So the rates of evolution vary enormously, and new species may appear suddenly in geologic terms, even though in real time it would have seemed like a very long, slow process. Think about how long the human lifespan is. Now, I also want to throw out there, it's okay if you're thinking, yeah, why not some of both? Because I think that's very possible too, that you have some that are much more slow and gradual, and then there may be some event that causes a fairly stable population that hasn't changed much to have a rapid alteration or a rapid um, evolution to its particular genotypes. Okay. All right, so here's a representation of both punctuated equilibrium on the left, switch that, punctuated equilibrium on the right, that's, and then gradualism on the left. So left one has slow, steady change over time versus the right, which has little to no change, and then boom, kind of a rapid burst of change, and so on and so forth. And it is fine if you want to think of this as being some of both. All right, guys. So that's it for today. Go ahead and work on your activities. Hope you're doing well. Stay happy, stay healthy, stay safe. Take care of yourselves. Bye bye.